Hello. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to give folks just a minute to come and join. Uh, but we're going to be talking about what ethical research looks like today, how to spot bad research, and why all of that matters. If you need CART, we have CART. You can click the button down below that says captions. That might be under another button that says more first to turn those on. The chat is not on today, but we do have the Q&A box going. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in there. We will probably have a limited amount of time and a lot of questions to go through. So if you have questions about things that aren't related to research or things that you just want to ask privately, feel free to email us at info@autisticadvocacy.org, and we'll have that information again when it's time to do the Q&A. Awesome. I think we can go ahead and get started. Let's go to the first slide. Awesome. So we are going to be talking about the scientific method and why that matters to ethical research. So the scientific method is a way that researchers learn about the world by asking questions and finding the answers through specific steps. And it's important that we follow all of these steps. We can't just skip any. So first, ask questions, figure out what you want to do. Second, find out what people already know about your question. That's super important because most of the time there's other research that's been done that can help you focus in on your question or find out that, oh, actually this question has already been answered and maybe I want to go a different route. Next, you want to make a hypothesis. A hypothesis is just your best guess on what will happen. It's not any guess. It's going to be based on other research that's been done and things that you know about the topic. Next, you're going to do an experiment to test your hypothesis. This is super important. You're going to then write down what happened in your experiment. It might not be what you were expecting, so you want to see if your hypothesis was right or wrong. Then you want to tell other people what you learned and see if you or other researchers can repeat your experiment. This is super important because we oftentimes want to see if that research can be repeated to make sure that there wasn't things mucking up the research. There aren't things like bias getting in the way that maybe we weren't totally right about the outcome. So it's important to see if other folks can repeat your experiments. And this is all going to be the basis for good, solid research. Next slide. So what we're here to talk about today, the dangers of bogus research and how you can tell, because it can be really hard when there's so much stuff going on and you're not always going to be an expert on the thing that you're like, I don't know if this is quite right. So the most important thing is that every part of the scientific method is important. We can't skip any of them. This also means that research tends to take a really long time. So you can tell if research is bad by checking if it follows that scientific method. If it seems like it's skipping any of those steps, you want to start questioning it. So we're going to give two examples of research that skips some parts of the scientific method and why that matters and can make it dangerous. Next slide. So it's important. You can't decide what your results are going to be before doing the research. That means that you're probably not going to know how long it's going to take before you get started. Even while you're doing it, you might not know how long it's going to take because we want to get real results, not just quick results. So recently, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., said that HHS will know the cause of autism by September. But we know that's not how research works. RFK Jr. picked a man named David Geyer to run a study about the cause of autism. But it's important to know that Geyer isn't a doctor, and he did research like this in the past that hurt autistic kids because he wrongly thinks that vaccines cause autism. We know that's not true. We have a lot of research that shows vaccines are safe and not connected to autism. And in fact, most of the research funding for autism looks at something called causation, which is the causes of autism. So this is an area we have a lot of information on. Next slide. So another example, we can't decide what our conclusions are going to be before doing research. So in April, HHS released a report about transgender kids. This report was super biased and it also lied about the data that it reviewed. So the report only talked to experts who already agreed with the conclusion that they wanted to show. That's not how we do good research. It's not looking at all the information, and it's lying about some of the information. So the report ignored experts who showed that it was wrong or lied about information. So the American Academy of Pediatrics did research about transgender kids, and HHS used some of their research and reported it incorrectly. And in fact, AAP said that the HHS report lied about their research. So we can't decide what the conclusion is going to be. We can guess, that's our hypothesis, what we think it's going to be, but we don't get to decide what the end result is. That's why we're doing experiments to find the truth. Next slide. So how does research actually work then? Research is a planned way of finding and collecting information. You find a study topic, you design the study, collect your data, analyze the data, and share the results. We use that information to answer questions and solve problems. And that can be things like, how best can we help autistic adults? And it can be things like, what is the most accessible way to do this thing? And then we share the information that we learn with other people. Next slide. So what does normal data collection look like in research? We've heard some ways that maybe don't seem quite right. So what is it supposed to look like? Number one is informed consent. People who agree to be part of a research study need to be told what data is going to be collected, how it's going to be used, and they need to agree to participate. Next is voluntary participation. That means no one is getting forced into it or tricked into it or pressured to give their data. We want to make sure people want to be involved and want to give their data freely. Next is de-identification. That means taking your personal information, like your name or where you live, and removing that so people can't be identified from the data, right? Then oversight and ethics review. So institutional review boards have to approve studies involving people. Researchers have rules, federal rules, that they have to follow, and these are super important to making sure that we are protecting people who are involved and giving their data for these studies. Next slide. So here are some examples we might have heard of recently of data collection that isn't normal. So the Department of Governmental Efficiency is accessing people's private information. A lot of us have heard about that. DOGE isn't a real government agency, even though we have that title, but they were reading private health information. This raises a concern about how data can be accessed without permission, and it makes people worry about what's happening with their data and what it can be used for. Another example is recently the IRS shared undocumented people's data with ICE. So the IRS agreed to share identifying tax documents from undocumented people with ICE. That raises a concern about consent and how misused data can be dangerous. People didn't consent for their data to be used in that way. Next slide. So we talked a little earlier about personal information. So what is personal identifiable information, or PII? Personal identifiable information is any information that can be used to figure out who you are, either by itself or if you put it all together, it connects back to a specific person. So that could be your name, it could be your birthday, your address, your social security number, or your diagnosis, things like that. There's a lot of things that go into PII. Researchers have to protect the PII of participants. That's an important part of research ethics. Next slide. So here are just some of the protections that exist when it comes to research. Some people have brought up HIPAA before. That's Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. HIPAA doesn't always apply to research, but in the cases that it does, research has to protect most health information, and you're required to get consent before sharing in most cases, but this has some loopholes that are important to know about. Generally, consent is required to share, though. Next is the Common Rule. This governs how federally funded research, so research that comes from the federal government, uses personal data. That requires informed consent and review from the IRB. Obviously, there are some limitations to the existing protections. For example, de-identified health information can be used without consent for things like databases, not registries, which would include personal identifiable information. So it's important to know those loopholes that exist, and it's important to know what rights we do have. Next slide. So let's look at some of the things that you can do, right? Because it is really scary when we see our data being used in these ways that we didn't consent to or that we don't quite understand. So number one, we can look for red flags in research. Look at the things that we talked about here. What kind of red flags are coming up when you see articles about some of the data, how some of the data is being used? So when there is no clear consent, you did not consent to giving your data, and there's not a way to ask people to consent or not. If there's no explanation of how your data is going to be used, it's just, hey, can we use this? That's a red flag. You want to know where that data is going and how it's going to be used. Also, if you have these requests or research from vague or made up groups like DOGE, that's not a green flag. Next, if you are asked to participate in research, ask questions. That is always your right. So ask them. If it seems like there's information missing and you're concerned, you saw some of these red flags, ask them, who's collecting the data? What do they want to do with it? Can I say no or opt out? And if the questions there trigger other red flags, what can you do about that? Number one, you can say no to giving your data if there are red flags. If someone reaches out to you about doing research, you have the right to say, no, I don't consent for my data to be used for this. You can also report unethical behavior, and that's something that you can do even if you weren't the one being asked. If your friend says, yeah, I got asked to give my data for this thing, but I don't quite understand, and it seems kind of red flagged, you can report that unethical behavior, and it's important to do so. You can also spread awareness and educate other people. That's why it's so important for us to know our rights, because even if we don't come up directly against these unethical red flag research calls for participants, we can tell other people, hey, you have rights in this situation and you can say no, and here's the things that you can be looking for. You can also tell your congresspeople to support policies that protect data rights. And this is super important because we, looked at some of those protections that exist, but we always need more protections, especially as people are trying to do different questionable things with our data. Next slide. This is probably the most important part. Confusion is the point of all of this. There's been a lot of back and forth and different articles coming out about things, and it seems confusing, and that is the point. It's really hard to follow what's happening and stop unethical research practices when you're confused about what's going on. So unethical research and surveillance proposals are meant to be confusing and scary. That makes it easier to hide what they're really doing. So you've seen announcements that use vague language and fake agency like DOGE, and that is confusing and scary because what's actually happening there? You have the public being given little to no information about what kind of data is being collected, why it's being collected, who is using it, and what the end goal is. And all of those things are scary and confusing. And it's easy to tell yourself that maybe I just don't understand research, but those things are intentional, right? When people are overwhelmed, it's a lot harder to speak out or fight back because it's not clear what exactly you're supposed to be doing or what you're supposed to be fighting against or which parts of this are allowed or not allowed or ethical or unethical. Confusion is an actual tactic. It's not a mistake that they're making. It's really easy to think like, oh, they're just incompetent. That's why it's coming out this way. But it's a real tactic that people use so that it is harder to know what's going on and fight back against it. So understanding our rights, sharing information that is easy for everyone to understand, that helps break through that fear and protect our communities is a must. That's the most important part, is if you know what your rights are, sharing that information with other people so that we know what's going on, so that we know when things like this are intentional. Big part of ethical, unethical research and everything that we've seen from various departments and groups and whatnot, it's all very, very specific, right? And we all want to try to understand it. So we're going to go to the next slide. This is the time I want to spend those time on your questions. What things are confusing you? What is coming up? What kind of things have you seen that you want to try to understand better? So you can put your questions in the Q&A box. Like I said, we'll probably have lots and lots of questions. If we have extra time and there's time for questions that aren't quite on topic, we will let you know. But otherwise, try to stay with the topic of, research ethics and data and all of that. If you have questions about other things or you want to ask your question privately, you can always email us at info@autisticadvocacy.org. You can also ask questions in the Q&A box anonymously if you prefer to do that. So I will give folks a sec if you want to put your questions in the Q&A box. Let me answer this one. So what can autistic and or autism-focused researchers do to help protect autistic people in their work and their studies? I think some of the big parts, and I'll also, if my colleagues have thoughts on this, please. I think some of the big things are presuming competence. I think this is especially if you're focused on autistic folks in your research, presuming competence, following general research guidelines as far as de-identifying information. And I think at ASAN, we generally share research that is community-based participatory research. So research where autistic folks are involved at every step. That means not just in the data collection, but in things like developing the research question and reaching out to folks and developing materials, all of that. If either of my colleagues have thoughts that they want to add, I'm going to just take a sip of water real quick. Awesome. Someone did ask if the slides will be available afterwards. Yes, and this recording will also go up on YouTube afterwards. Someone noted, just worth noting that some of this doesn't apply to research on things like FC that we know work without quantitative research. Oh, thank you. Go ahead, Nora.
Nora in the chat has said, I would add that diversity of participants is really important. If it's just white autistic people, that's not good enough. And that's in response to the earlier question that we had.
Someone asked, or someone said, AI face scans, eye tracking, and micromimics can easily detect ADHD and or autism via deep emotional analysis algorithms. How dangerous is involuntarily gained user data by AR and VR devices like that, since there would be no way to say no to that kind of data use, right? I would say a few things. One, I think this is one of those cases where first, I would say I don't agree that it can necessarily easily detect ADHD or autism. I know there's this idea that it can. We've seen lots of devices like this that try to use AR, VR, AI to detect autism. And a lot of those things are usually based in kind of bunk science or assumptions about autism that aren't necessarily true. I would also say this is a case where it's important to have regulation around how data is used, how it is achieved. Yeah, I think that is one of those cases where there is more legislation needed to make sure that data isn't being gotten in those kind of dangerous ways. Someone asked, how can we encourage individuals with autism to safely participate in research groups or studies? I think there's a few ways of doing that. One of the a lot of folks reach out to ASAN to share research studies, calls for participants, things like that. I think the biggest thing is connecting with autistic organizations, autistic folks, autistic groups. I always encourage folks to reach out to self-advocacy groups in their areas. Um, we can post that link in the chat in a moment, but you can find self-advocacy groups in your areas. And I always think it's good to, one, get as diverse a group of autistic folks as you can, but also reach out where you know there are autistic folks. It's really easy if you don't have any connections to just post it on social media and say, I didn't really find a ton of autistic folks. But I think it's worth the effort of reaching out to groups with those connections, reaching out to people, reaching out to other autistic researchers, I think is always a great start. Oh, question on Noor's comment. How do autistic researchers get around A, the diagnostic catch-22 for BIPOC autistic folks, and B, build trust and outreach with BIPOC autistic communities so that this is done appropriately and well? This is needed work, and there's a lot of understood skepticism towards biomedical research from BIPOC and or autistic communities. This is something I want to do, but I'm not sure how to get started. Go ahead, Noor. And if you want to put it in the chat, I can read that also.
I'm okay to talk. So, well, I would say that in terms of getting around the catch-22 of uh, getting a professional diagnostic within BIPOC autistic communities, there isn't so much a getting around it as a researcher because that problem will still continue to exist. I would say that if your research is designed in such a way that it allows for self-diagnosed autistic people to come in, that can help lower that barrier for BIPOC autistics. In an event where that is not possible, well, I know, for example, some universities only allow, unless a study is exclusively about self-diagnosed autistic people, would not allow that to be possible as a criteria, for example. I think that the next best step there is definitely to both like navigate speaking with groups led by and for BIPOC autistics, but I would also say that like part of that is a structural issue, right? And the way to like navigate and work on that issue is both to like promote understanding of what a professional diagnosis looks like and what tools it does or does not give you, as well as like combating kind of the fear and the stigma that has understandably started to come up as a result of bad research around getting a diagnosis. And that's going to understandably impact BIPOC communities significantly, unfortunately, given our country's history of medical experimentation and other forms of medical abuse towards people of color, right? So there's levels to this. So I would say, like, if it's possible to open things up to self-diagnosed folks, yes. If it's possible to research and get input from BIPOC-led autistic groups, absolutely. I would also say at the same time, though, both as a researcher and as someone in broader autistic community spaces, kind of advocating for the systems change piece is long-term how we get around that. In terms of building trust and outreach with BIPOC autistic communities, the key thing here and what most people miss is being consistent and actually actively listening to BIPOC autistic communities when you are reaching out, and also not making it transactional. So, what I mean by that is that let's say you're an autistic researcher or you are doing research about autism and you're not in the community. It is really, really critical that you're not just reaching out when you're trying to get people for a study, but rather that you are also reaching out well before you need anything from anyone, right? And offering to either volunteer for a group, asking if there are ways you can be helpful, asking if folks might benefit from or want an explanation of, say, research ethics or principles. Stuff like what we are doing right now and leading education efforts is something that researchers can be really useful for in terms of helping break down really big, complicated medical data into more understandable pieces. So, like, I feel like this is going to sound a bit reductive, but like the best way to build community with BIPOC autistic people is to actually build community with BIPOC autistic people, which is to say, keep in contact, build the friendships, and continue to build that relationship over time. And if it's going both ways, then that's going to mean that when you're reaching out and when you're asking for help, that's going to be more organic, and people are going to be less likely to think that you're just there to exploit them, which, if you're going about this ethically, you hopefully would not be.
Awesome, thank you. And then I'll just jump to this one since it's related. Regarding self-diagnosed autistic people, a two-part question. Does current autistic research weigh for one, affordability of diagnosis, and two, different communities? If folks have thoughts, please feel free to jump in. As far as does it weigh this thing? I know there has been research. There's definitely lots of research around like different autistic communities. But if you're asking about specific ones, I know ASAN has held a symposium a bit ago on research priorities amongst different autistic folks with intellectual disabilities, non-speaking autistic folks with high support needs, autistic folks of color, Black autistic people specifically, and autistic people outside of the US. As far as where does it all weigh in, I will let other folks join in.
So I'm going to speak a little bit broadly because I don't feel super confident to get a very specific answer, but it's the thing of your mileage may vary. And what I mean by that is in an ideal research situation that is doing community-based participatory research, which is a very fancy phrase that means like in this case, autistic people are involved in every part of the research. They're part of the team that's doing the research. They're the ones who are like kind of guiding the questions that are being researched. And so in the best case, yes, it should be weighed as a thing that acknowledges the barriers there, just as like historic racism should be a part of the factors thought about when we're thinking about why are fewer people of color diagnosed. Like those kind of things should be factored in. They're not always. If you're looking at a piece of research, though, the people who wrote up the report about it, the researchers, should tell you stuff about their work. And like particularly of like, did they think about that when they were pulling people who they wanted to talk to for their research? Did they think about why those folks might not come to them in terms of either community history with researchers or with access to diagnosis? So that's stuff you can check on your own, but unfortunately, there's not really like a uniform standard, which does suck.
Thank you. And then someone asked, isn't it difficult to even begin to research autism when there's such a large umbrella for diagnosis? Doesn't the parameters of any research have to first define the word autism and outline how the research will apply? I don't think necessarily we have to redefine autism since we have a definition and a diagnosis of autism. If you're focusing on a specific group of autistic folks, I think that's important to point out. But I think it's also important not to have arbitrary eligibility guidelines or definitions of autism. That is a basis of the kinds of research that we share typically, things like not including self-diagnosed autistic folks, not including autistic folks with intellectual disabilities, not including autistic folks who use AAC, and not using vague terms like high and low functioning that don't really describe what you're kind of trying to do research on. So I don't think we necessarily have to start with defining autism since we have an understanding of autism. But if you want to explain the autistic community or the history of autistic self-advocacy, I think that's always good to include in research since folks aren't necessarily going to be knowledgeable about that topic. Then someone asked, I am autistic and use a speech device. What data can AAC stakeholders legally collect? Thanks. I'm not sure what you mean specifically, but there are autistic folks who use AAC involved in research, both on the like participant side and also the researcher side. Folks like Communication First put out things on research priorities back in 2023. Communication First released their research priorities for AAC users, included what they wanted to focus on. So they talked about things like greatest unmet needs of AAC users. So how has AAC failed us? What changes do we want to see? Roadblocks to effective communication for all, priorities in their lives, and research process issues. So I will add that to the chat while Alex goes ahead and talks.
So I had a different understanding of the question, and I'm wondering if this person attendee is asking, in other words, like your AAC device or the software that you're using, what information of yours can it collect about you? That is also going to be a thing of that totally depends on what agreement your like your equipment or your software has. That is the same as like, at least I'm guessing that it should work the same way, say, our user agreements on like our phone or a software does. You can look through that, and I see Nora also might have thoughts on this, so.
Yes, I was just going to basically confirm that, yes, in terms of what data can legally be collected, both by the company, by caregivers or guardians, or other people who have contact with the device, will vary pretty dramatically depending on both what user agreements you sign when getting the device or the program, as well as if the device is going through insurance. Because if it's going through insurance, in some cases, HIPAA compliance might apply in terms of what the insurance company is seeing versus what, say, a speech pathologist or someone else who's interacting with the device is seeing. So, in general, your best bet there is going to be to both read the end license user agreement or other type of like basically privacy permissions section attached to the app or device that you're using. And that can help you better understand where any information being sent there is going. And if you are using, say, a like AAC specific device that's being funded through insurance or a nonprofit, you can also contact them directly to ask what information they're regularly collecting, as well as what options you have for opting out if there are parts of that that you aren't comfortable with.
I think that question asker clarified. Can AAC manufacturers collect my chat history?
Great question. Short version is basically that um, it depends on the app or device being used. My impression is that generally speaking, you have to opt into that, but that it is possible in some cases. I've usually seen that only really brought up in use cases where people are getting technical assistance and are trying to track issues with input, for example. So if, say, you're hitting a button and it's not transcribing the same information, like you're hitting A and it's giving C, for example, but in use cases like that, that'll sometimes be in your user agreement, and it'll specify that it would either be just for repairs, or if there's other use cases where they might collect your chat history, how they would get that info and under what circumstances they might need to use it.
Thank you. And a follow-up to my previous question, I was wondering if you folks could speak more about the affordability of diagnosis and how that might affect research. Diagnoses aren't cheap, and many autistic folks are and have to be self-diagnosed. I think this is one of the reasons that it's really important. Obviously, if you're doing research on the affordability of diagnosis and how that affects who's getting diagnosed and when, um, that is its own thing and important research, in fact. But I think that's why it's important generally to not have arbitrary definitions or guidelines around autism that are like, you have to be professionally diagnosed by this age, by um, and have these specific experiences, if especially if that's not what the research is about. If, for example, you're doing research about autistic adults navigating higher ed for the first time, you don't necessarily need to include eligibility requirements about being diagnosed by a certain age. Um, because the fact of the matter is that there are lots and lots of autistic folks who don't get diagnosed. We know there are diagnosis disparities, especially amongst autistic folks of color, autistic women, autistic queer and trans folks, amongst others. So affordability of diagnosis, I think, affects the kinds of research that is done around, how that affects our community, but also affects how we should be um, looking at research and creating those eligibility guidelines. Awesome. Um, if other folks have thoughts to add, feel free, but otherwise, um, do you all know of any apps or means that we can use to determine if our um, PII data has been accessed, and how we can protect our data further? As far as apps or means of telling if your data has been used, I'm not personally familiar, aside from things that look like if your email or things have been used like on the dark web, that kind of tracking, but in research, I'm not familiar with that. As far as protecting your data, um, there are some of the things that we talked about, some of the laws and guidelines that protect us, but that's also why I think there does need to be further legislation protecting folks' data from unethical research. Um, Nor, Alex, if you have other thoughts, though.
I would agree with that. I would say that in terms of if your private health information has been accessed, there's not, to the best of my knowledge, there's not like an app that specifically just looks for that. I think part of the thought process there being that it would be necessary for people to be able to show that they've accessed that information to tell you that they got it in the first place. And most of the places that are going to be doing that. So, for example, if your doctor participates in a public health exchange and uses anonymized data, they're legally required to tell you that. So, they're going to basically be working from the assumption that you already know what information they have access to and what they are providing to other people. So, the best way to kind of navigate figuring out what places have access to a specific piece of data is basically to go to where that information is stored. So, for example, if you're curious about, say, your pharmacy records, for instance, like the record of what medications you take, you are able to go to your pharmacy to ask the pharmacist, hey, is it possible to get a copy of my privacy rights as someone who uses this pharmacy to like better understand like where my health data is going? And from there you can read about like basically what places are legally permitted to like gain access to or use that data under what circumstances and in what cases it's anonymized or not anonymized. The vast majority of the time these are all going to be fairly standard across the board in terms of things like HIPAA protections, for example. But if you are curious and want to like kind of dig in more, that's going to be your best bet, is to kind of think backwards and kind of start from where is that information and then check with where that is basically to figure out kind of what other places have contact with that info, and under what circumstances.
Awesome. Uh, then Someone asked, how can you navigate an individual that may be masking when participating in research and the impact that will have on the outcomes? I think that's very dependent on the research topic, the kind of research that you're doing. Yeah, I think that one's tricky because there is in fact research on like autistic masking. So I think autistic people are autistic even when we mask. Um, if you're thinking about like if you're meaning autistic people who um, don't know that they're autistic or something like that, obviously that is a different topic. Alex, go ahead.
Oh yeah, sure. Again, I don't have a very clear, neat answer. I think it's a thing that researchers, because masking is a really common experience for autistic people. It's a way we protect ourselves. It's a way we like help cope with a world that's largely not built for autistic people. And that's going to show up in the research world as well. I think that's something that researchers who are really interested in working with the autistic community in a community way um, have to plan for and figure out the thing of like, there's a thing that researchers do for folks who don't do research. It's called controlling variables. And I know stuff about research. I'm not a formal researcher myself, so bear with my explanation here. But essentially, if you are aware that there's gonna be some stuff that might, like Dean was saying earlier, that might impact the ability for your experiment to be replicated, that's part of why experiments get replicated to make sure like something's consistent and a different, like, there's not something wonky sort of throwing off the research. And I think that's something that like researchers should think about is the fact of like, yeah, folks will be masking. How can we kind of control that? How can we and by control that, I don't mean control the people who are part of your research. I mean, address that showing up in your research. Are there ways to make folks more comfortable? Like if you're doing interviews with people as part of your research, maybe you ask what formats they want to are most comfortable for them, whether it's video, whether it's in person, whether it's getting to write their answers to you. Like figure out how you can create spaces that make autistic people feel comfortable enough to unmask if that's a big concern for you. That's just a off the dome answer.
Nora, go ahead.
I was just going to add one quick thing on to what Alex said, which is that absolutely creating the environment such that people can, like, to the extent that they feel comfortable unmasking, be able to if they choose. On that note, one thing that a lot of people get wrong is not asking your questions directly or asking questions in a way that is very non-specific or non-literal, and not controlling for that when you are like trying to get certain data out of autistic people. This is something that usually folks will try to factor in during like an ethics section in my experience. But like if, for example, you're trying to like understand if an autistic person is married or single, for instance, um, asking that directly, like specifically asking, are you in a relationship? Are you married? You will get the specific answer. But if you ask things like, for example, do you live alone, you're not necessarily going to get the second degree to get to the answer you're actually looking for, because what does alone mean? Does it mean that my family is here sometimes? Does that mean I'm here with a pet? Do I have a roommate? Do I have a sibling, et cetera, et cetera? So like be specific. That's going to be a chunk of that. Be specific.
Thank you. And then I'm going to summarize this one, but someone asked if there are any insights we might be able to share on how to handle, for example, holistic researchers criticizing a decision to include self-diagnosed individuals in research. I think there are a few ways to approach that. I think because we were talking about, speaking from the community, you can show things like Aspire or ASAN's research guidelines, and just where these ideas of including self-diagnosed folks come from. Sharing things like ASAN's stance on self-diagnosis, or the disparities, the numbers that we do know of how many folks don't get diagnosed as easily, don't have access to diagnosis, or for various reasons do not want diagnosis right now. I think showing that data coming from the community is really important, and might be a good start to the conversation. I think there is, sorry, yes, Aspire is an organization, for clarity's sake, that does very, very good research around autism. But I think sharing information on community-centered participatory research, and how I think inherently that approach should include self-diagnosed autistic folks, because it should include our community in general. And so many of us don't have access to diagnosis, or don't have access to diagnosis before a certain age. Thank you, Nora. I highly recommend checking out Aspire. Yes, their healthcare toolkit is very good and very important. It includes a section for autistic folks, autistic patients, and healthcare professionals and providers. And Nora has that link in the chat. But the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education. I think sharing the existing research, like we said, important part, sharing the existing research on self-diagnosed autistic folks, and the barriers to diagnosis, I think is an important part of it. I definitely understand wanting to have that answer prepared and be ready for that, because that is the thing that we come up against a lot. Often non-autistic folks getting upset about the inclusion of self-diagnosed autistic folks. But that is a good portion of our community, and it is important to include as many folks as possible in autism research. Next question. Someone said, what would you say to someone who is hesitant to pursue a formal diagnosis in light of current events? I don't know that I have a clean-cut answer to this. I don't know that there's ever necessarily a clean-cut answer to diagnosis, because I think, one, we can't give medical advice, but also it is a very personal decision, especially if that is a decision you're making as an adult. I will say there are, of course, protections around our data, and there are folks like ASAN continuing to make sure that there are protections around autistic folks' data. But I also think that it is a personal decision. So I don't necessarily know that I have advice, medical or philosophical, but I recognize that it is also a really challenging time to decide if you want to pursue a diagnosis right now. I will also say, as we have reiterated a few times, that self-diagnosis is valid. You are still part of the community. I always recommend ASAN's book, Welcome to the Autistic Community, which came before my time. So I'm recommending it because I genuinely believe that it is helpful and good, and a good start to understanding, this community that folks are a part of, even if they don't choose to pursue a formal diagnosis or don't choose to pursue it right now. But Alex and Nora, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I would say, and this is speaking more personally because, as Dean said, ASAN cannot officially give you any kind of medical guidance. But I think if you are feeling hesitant right now to get a diagnosis, that is obviously understandable. And also, like, this might be a time where you weigh why you like make two categories of a pro and a con of if I seek to pro being what good things do I think will come from me seeking diagnosis right now, and cons be what are risks that I feel like I might be getting, like taking on for myself if I get a diagnosis right now. And sort of going through those and making like using that to help you kind of make the decision if now feels like a right time to try and get diagnosed, if maybe you want to wait until later, like that kind of thing, I think can be something that can help because there is uncertainty with that, especially just because it is a medical thing, regardless of the climate.
Thank you. And then another question just regarding masking. Has there been comparative historical research on research with other communities that have had to be closeted, for example, LGBTQIA2S? Um, I'm not familiar with like super extensive research on the topic. I'm familiar with more informal articles and writings on the topic because, um, of course, there are so many communities and queer folks, especially who have been closeted, and that is a big part of the history. But I'm not familiar with any formal research. I would love to see formal research, but I'm not familiar with any. Awesome. And then another question, another that I'll summarize. But how are you making sure that your advocacy uh, is including folks with mental health disabilities and mental health self-advocates? And what are you doing to collaborate with them, including folks who publicly identify as having mental health disabilities? For sure. I think the MAD movement, um, there ASAN does a lot of work with folks who are publicly identify as mental health advocates, who are doing really cool work. For example, Project Let's does super good work. Um, and sorry, I would recommend checking out ASAN's newer newer resource, Beyond Coercion and Institutionalization, which talks about the need for improved behavioral support services, which obviously includes a lot of autistic folks and other folks with IDD who also have mental health disabilities, because a lot of the research and a lot of the services that are available for autistic folks and the folks who have mental health disabilities are siloed very specifically. So proper research and resources and services for autistic folks with mental health disabilities are more difficult to find because these things are kind of siloed, as if the MAD community and the autistic self-advocacy community are separate things rather than one, groups that work together, and also overlapping groups. There's lots of autistic folks and other folks with IDD that also have mental health disabilities, and who are advocates for both communities. I think that's an important part of the work is, one, working with communities who are experiencing similar issues with research, healthcare, the services that we're able to access, institutionalization, and also recognizing where those overlaps are naturally happening in folks. Um, if folks have other thoughts.
Yes. One thing I would add to that too is that um, in general, when kind of navigating folks who are dual diagnosed, it's very much also worth noting that people who have both a mental health and a developmental disability diagnosis, rather, very, very frequently, even if they are public about both, people will only know them as developmentally disabled. Very, very frequently, in general, people will, if they are forward facing about their disabilities, will get known as one or the other rather than both. So it And for that matter as well, it's a very personal choice to what extent people choose to disclose their mental health disabilities, both within and outside of the autistic community. And it is both really important to acknowledge that we are working with the mental health disability community and broader mental health and MAD movement, and also simultaneously that we do not and will never require people to disclose all of their disabilities or diagnoses, including mental health ones, in order for us to work with them or to prove anything, because that's not appropriate or reasonable.
Yeah, I want to second that. Especially and also highlight, like, I think we got into it a bit of there's a lot of parallel work across these movements, especially when we're looking at things like institutionalization and things like conservatorship or guardianship and the right for people to continue to have the right to make their own choices about their lives. And like Nora is saying, especially because there is often this demand of proof upon people with disabilities across disabilities, like that we have to sort of justify what we're asking for or show that we are disabled enough to need supports or that we are capable enough to make our own choices. I think not pushing for people to have to disclose and tell their own stories or tell their own diagnoses in order to be working in movement spaces and doing cross movement work for these goals, I think is really important.
Thank you. Another question. For context, I'm an autistic person and work in data management for Alzheimer's research in an operational capacity. So not a researcher, but work with communities of researchers. Sometimes we have data on Alzheimer's patients who are also autistic, and depending on the study, that information is sometimes relevant to the question being asked. Do you have any advice on ways we can protect dual diagnosed folks' privacy concerns concerning data linkage attacks, especially considering the current political climate and some of the risks associated with what the administration has said they would like to do? So protecting folks with dual diagnosis. I will turn it over to my colleagues if you have thoughts, but I would also, again, recommend, oh no, beyond coercion, sorry, beyond coercion and institutionalization, because there's a lot of discussion on dual diagnosis and data silos, and how that affects folks. But Nora and Alex, if you have thoughts on protecting folks' data, dual diagnosed folks.
I would say that in general, the main thing I have heard in the realm of like folks who have more than one medical condition in research practices, typically the IRB or other folks that you're working with that are navigating protections around data privacy will usually be able to provide input about basically if and when it's possible to like depersonalize the data or to like prevent attaching the diagnosis to a specific person versus say like a number or a de-identified piece of information to just track that someone was involved kind of thing. So I would say if it's possible to like check in with folks around that, that might be like one possible starting point for trying to, if you have concerns about like kind of having data leakage there, to try and kind of work proactively rather than reactively.
Thank you. And I will give folks a question if there, or give folks a moment if there are any more questions before we wrap up. Awesome. Seeing no more questions, I want to thank everyone again for coming. I know this is a really tricky and current topic. So I'm glad that folks are interested in learning and talking more about what ethical research looks like, why it is dangerous when we do not follow these research, when we don't follow research ethics, and how we can identify these things and protect ourselves and each other. If you have questions that you think of later or that you didn't want to ask with everyone, feel free to email us. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you again for being here.
And yes, this recording will be available to everybody after the event. You can find it on our YouTube page. Thank you so much.